my name is Tameera Mohamed, and I'm doing my master's in sociology at Dalhousie. It's in critical health studies, and I'm particularly interested in trauma and sexual violence and kind of the relationship between the two and how feminists are conceptualizing sexual violence and what role trauma plays in those conceptions and definitions.
You were talking a bit about how this script for sexual trauma has developed, and I was interested in that. But when did trauma become the lens through which exclusively we spoke about sexual assault?
Mm-hmm. Well, trauma, so the idea of trauma came out of anti-war activism and after the Vietnam War, and then it was picked up pretty quickly. It was at the same time that feminists were really engaging in anti-rape activism, and so I think it was in 1974, maybe don't quote me on that, but 1974 that Anne Burgess and Linda Holmström, one was a sociologist and one was a nurse at a hospital, undertook a study. They were noticing that women who were coming into the hospital post-assault were symptomatic in the same way that men were post-war. And so they wanted to track kind of like these symptoms and compare them against what was thought of as like combat neuroses or shell shock. And then they developed rape trauma syndrome. And then after that, it kind of took off. And so much research went into looking at the traumas of sexual violence. And there was a special section in like the National Mental Health kind of center in the States and that kind of stuff. And I think that's when then the language of the experience of sexual assault changed to really include this idea of trauma in a way that it hadn't before. And it brought a lot of attention to the issue and kind of like the severity of sexual violence and the impact that it has on people's lives. But now what I guess, and what we were talking about and what I'm interested in is what the consequences are of that discourse when we're focused on an individual's kind of emotional response to an incident, and we're not as focused on the incident itself, or the incident itself needs to be qualified in the language of mental health and emotion and is not sufficient on its own.
And obviously, in having this conversation, it's a challenging conversation in a way because it sounds as if you challenge the narrative, you're saying that sexual assault survivors are not trauma victims, or it's not traumatized, it's not serious, and that's obviously not what we're trying to get at. But I was interested in this idea that there's a particular, perhaps social pressure, social narrative around trauma that becomes the script that women almost feel compelled to follow in speaking about sexual assault.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so definitely not at all saying that sexual violence isn't traumatic for some women or most women or anything like that, or for anyone who experiences sexual violence, really. But what I think was interesting in the Giancomeshi case and the coverage of it is that both trauma was a part of the conversation on both ends, both those who wanted to say that, you know, what happened wasn't sexual violence, and those who wanted to say that what happened was sexual violence. Both ends were using trauma as a way of explaining the incident and the behavior after. So, you know, those who were pointing to the women's behavior and saying that, you know, if the incident had been sexual assault, and if so, it would have been traumatic, and then the women wouldn't have gone back. And then feminists are saying, well, actually, those are symptoms of trauma, and so it makes sense that the women went back or identified with their aggressor and that kind of stuff. But no one is challenging the trauma discourse. Both are kind of pulling on it, and so maybe then in that sense it's not working in our favor. Like, as you said, it's kind of becomes the script through which all experiences of sexual violence are interpreted, and then if somebody doesn't fit that script, if they're not traumatized after an experience, or if they don't present with the symptoms of trauma that we are identifying in this moment, then their experience is no longer valid in some way.
And it seems that that's it, that it becomes a validating moment. So, for example, when you have the complainants in the trial saying, well, I couldn't look at his face or hear his voice because it traumatized me. And then part of what sinks their credibility is that it's brought up, well, you did look at him, you were writing him letters. And that question of why a woman might feel compelled to say that, because it's as if the experience wouldn't be meaningful if you said, it affected me, it was a difficult experience. But yes, you know, I could still listen to the radio, or I had complex feelings about it. So almost this very extreme script becomes, if you don't adhere to that script, or if you don't feel that way, or if that's not actually your experience, you still need that script because otherwise people won't take you seriously or won't think you're credible. And in this case, it sort of ends up trapping the woman because it's that very expected dialogue that they follow that then is used to say they're not credible.
Exactly, yeah. And so, you know, they were drawing on that script to kind of make their stories what people would want to hear, but then that didn't work out for them in the end. And I think that's like that's unfortunate for the people who are in those situations where then there's no other script for them to draw on to make their case legitimate, to draw attention to their experience and say that it was like not okay, you know?
And it seems a very feminized script in a particular way, so that when women are represented as vulnerable or victims or as helpless, which is a very, particularly for white women, obviously a very historical, very patriarchal way of seeing white women, and it justified, for example, lynchings. It justified, obviously, the surveillance of white women's bodies, keeping white women in the home, chaperoning white women, because white women were so vulnerable and their bodies needed to be protected by white men. So this has been in the history of white patriarchy. And it seems that part of this script fits that. So rather than the image of, you know, angry feminists or feminists that have other emotions or feminists fighting for abortion rights, there's this kind of section of retrogressive conservative people that are all right with the image of a helpless female victim. So I wonder the ways that part of this, the pushing of the script, not necessarily by women, but by elements that aren't particularly sympathetic to feminism, but can handle the idea of, a helpless woman that's victimized in particular ways.
Totally, yeah, that we can kind of swoop in and save because, yeah, exactly. And I think it's interesting because historically anti-rape activism was very angry and was like very aggressive, and we've moved, I think I'm seeing a shift in this very emotional aspect, but only particular emotions, as you've mentioned, like anger would not be an acceptable trauma response in the courtroom or to kind of the mainstream ideology of what is a victim of or a survivor of sexual violence and what are her responses and kind of stuff. So yeah, I think particular emotions, feminized emotions, are the kinds of responses that we're allowing to be seen post-assault, which really, really shapes how people can actually experience those things and talk about them.
So you suggested that there's a way that the trauma script becomes a way of not speaking about the incident itself. I wonder if you could elaborate on that. So it becomes, you said, about people's response rather than what actually happened.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, in the Gomeshi case particularly, we've seen, how people kind of picked on the women's behavior post-assault as being a part of the assault itself, right? As if they can't be separated. And so if the incident itself is not enough to be problematic, if the response is needed to problematize the initial incident, then yeah, the trauma script becomes the kind of only thing that can legitimize that experience itself, and that's not enough. And I think this is the most clear example of that, is when all of the women's behavior afterwards was what was important to the case and not actually the incident itself.
I've seen, as a black person speaking against racism, the same kind of idea that if you say, I recognize this and I want to speak about it, people will demand that you speak about how it affected you. So if you don't say, I was crying about it or I was shaking about it, or, if you don't have that script, it is used to therefore say that it can't have been serious. So you end up having to adopt this language of feeling, which is then in other ways used to discredit you. It takes away agency in particular ways, right, that then affect how you're able to organize or how you're able to speak about your own empowerment. But at the same time, I think there's ways in which it's easier to deal with damaged people than it is to deal with people that, as you say, are angry or people that are resistant.
Yeah, or people who just want to say that something's a problem. And I think also and as I mentioned before, like there's this idea of the concept of trauma is expanding to include more and more experiences, and that happened when it was applied to sexual violence, and I think it's happening now where we recognize as well as the idea of sexual violence is expanding, right? So more and more experiences are being counted as violating that maybe wouldn't have been considered before. And then if we apply the trauma discourse to those experiences as well, then it almost gets to a point where you have to wonder if we can problematize things without talking about trauma. And I think there is a concept called insidious trauma that talks about that the everyday effects of, say, like racism and sexism, the idea that we can't walk outside safely or that we live in fear being traumatic. And then it almost turns every person who experiences oppression into a traumatized individual rather than an angry person or a political, you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
So I'm interested in the consequences of that. And then also with acute trauma, there's an idea that it's very linear, right? So you experience an event and then you're traumatized post-event, where we know the reality of these forms of oppression is not that it's a single event or that it can be, captured in this single moment. We're often experiencing these things on a daily basis or or many times throughout our life. And so I think that medical idea about trauma is very much a part of our current trauma discourse, but it doesn't actually necessarily work for these kinds of things that we're talking about in the way that we probably want them to.
Mm-hmm. And it also, so when people are having this conversation, which clearly I don't think anybody who's viewing the justice system thinks that the justice system is working for sexual assault for marginalized people, for people of color, Indigenous people in general. So clearly it's a problematic system. It's a colonial system, a system based on European ideals that has a history of racism, all of those obviously problematic ideals that go into the way that we administer justice. But then when we have, say, talk of the sexual assault courts and setting up alternate systems, and the trauma dialogue is really key there, because there's this idea of how we interview witnesses in so people call it, trauma-informed parallel system, for example, which, without discounting that, because clearly victims have spoken about feeling re-traumatized or how going through court is harder than going through the original assault. Rather than saying exactly what I said, that the justice system doesn't work for women because it's colonial, it's patriarchal, and it's racist, we say it doesn't work because women are traumatized.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And so the emotional aspects, the psychological, the idea of damage, of people being damaged, because that's kind of what trauma, I mean, not in a feminist way. Feminists certainly wouldn't say, oh, yeah, women are damaged, right?
Mm-hmm.
But the medical idea of trauma is that we're abnormally affected by these experiences, and our psyche is then damaged in some way, right? And we have to recuperate from that.
So when women are identifying the ways that the justice system does not serve them, those are ways that are also not serving Indigenous people. They're not serving Black people. So we know that when defendants go in, if you're a racialized defendant, there's all kinds of judgments being made on your body. We know that the majority of women that are in prison not only are victims of sexual assault, but also in many cases are there for crimes like not telling on their boyfriend or lying about what their boyfriend said, or he stored guns in the house. And so that we know that there's all kinds of ways, for example, that women's discourse is not believed in court, that, someone who comes from circumstances that don't match a judge that likely comes from a white upper-class background. So these kind of ideas of credibility that have historically affected Indigenous people, have affected Black people, and resulted in our much more disproportionate participation in the system, our heavier sentencing. And that's not separate from the experiences of people of women that are victims of sexual assault. But there's this kind of division that sexual assault is uniquely unjust, and it's not tied to all these other histories. And of course, they're intimately tied together. That's why Black Lives Matter Toronto was also partnering with I Believe survivors and hosting people, because there's a recognition that this injustice to women is also part of the injustice against Black people. Mm-hmm. So it seems like it's almost a separating discourse as well, that women are uniquely damaged by the system in this particular way, when in fact what's impacting sexual assault survivors is also impacting young Indigenous men, young Black men, the growing rates of Indigenous and Black women who are incarcerated as well.
Yeah, it's true. And what you said about credibility and the idea that this is not a unique problem, and it's not a problem that's just emerging now, but because it's somehow related to trauma and the idea of women as vulnerable and as victims, it's being problematized now in the courts and stuff.
It's a difficult conversation, because I know when I was asking you about your research and we were talking about it, we were both like, it's difficult to talk about this because you don't want to sound as if you're minimizing sexual assault or denying people's experiences or participating in some kind of denial of the impact of rape. But so I mean, obviously you're speaking about this from a feminist perspective, from a perspective that clearly sees sexual assault as a problem. So what do you think is opened up by when we look at this discourse of trauma and think about it and where it came from and how it developed, and why is that important to do?
Well, I think it's important because, as you said, there becomes a very dominant discourse that you can't really challenge, and you don't make friends challenging, and you get into issues so the kinds of things that we've been saying, some people are going to be probably pretty offended by, despite the fact that we're actually all trying to work towards a common goal, but we're seeing a problem with the way that it's being talked about right now. And I think the benefits come when we can kind of interrogate. I think we forget sometimes that we didn't create these discourses, that we didn't come up with the idea of trauma, like us feminists today, that this was kind of a medical concept that, yes, we kind of played a role historically in developing, but it's really a part of the medical establishment, which has never been really on anybody's side. But we forget that sometimes, and becomes so much a part of how we understand things and how things make sense to us that we stop interrogating it. And I think that becomes a problem when, in the case of the women in the Jian Ghomeshi trial, they have no other alternative way of speaking about their experiences that is in any way legitimate or will be recognized. And so this is not intended at all to minimize the experiences of those people whose experiences match up to this discourse perfectly or very well, but to recognize that there are many people whose experiences don't fit this description and who still need to be recognized, and whose experiences need to be problematized just as much.
Also, that idea, as you said, the medicalization of women, so the old idea of hysteria, which, clearly located women's mental health in relationship to, our wandering wombs or our reproductive capacities, or the older sense that to be sexually violated, that a woman's sexuality was so important, her virginity, her purity of her body. So there's this old, very retrogressive discourse that this can dovetail with, again, not through feminists necessarily, but the idea that rather than seeing rape as tied to also issues of reproductive justice, of issues of bodily autonomy, of women liberating themselves sexually, part of the victim narrative can become, it's terrible because it's so awful that a woman, the most important part of a woman is her purity, and rape violates that. So it can tie into, in the way that it can become used in patriarchal ways, as you said, the idea that we now need to rescue women, that women become helpless in the face of sexual assault, rather than women who recognize this as a social problem can resist it and can come up with new forms.
I think there are probably 100 more things that I could say, because I'm really just exploring this for the first time. I mean, in the wake of the Jian Ghomeshi trial, I've had a lot of new thoughts about it. And so I think, I don't know. There was something that we had talked about before, which was kind of the idea also of post-traumatic growth. And so I'm interested too in what you said about the history of hysteria, and that I don't think sometimes we realize that the trauma concept actually comes out of hysteria, and that was the initial way of understanding women's response to sexual violation, right? And then it was kind of turned on its head a little bit by Freud at some point. But initially, that was what hysteria was supposed to be capturing, was this kind of response. And then we kind of move forward and we get trauma, and now we're in this stage of, I've seen people talk about post-traumatic growth, and it seems like a way of kind of what's the word I'm looking for, resisting and taking these concepts and using it in a way that works for us. But I also think we need to ask ourselves, how is it actually still working for patriarchy, and how is this still fitting into what works within our social structure?
And I think we saw that in some of the sort of polarizing discourse around the trial, particularly with Marie Henein, where there becomes sort of one model for what a woman has to behave like or look like. And Henein, who's a woman of color, but obviously is framed as this aggressor, or more extremely as someone who's betraying women. And she speaks about this, that a man would not be accused in the same way. Is a female judge betraying women if she acquits? And she raises this as a kind of sexist discourse, right? But you also get particularly this very, I think it's also racially inflected discourse around, the aggressive woman of color who's described as angular, or much is made of her clothes and her shoes. And this, of course, ties back into very old narratives of women of color as masculine and therefore unrapeable. So it actually ties into a lot of the ways that women of color are further victimized. But it's almost like there's only one narrative for a woman, and you have to be, so you're either a victim, or you're Marie Henein and you're this terrible aggressor, you're this barracuda, you're this shark, you're this Hannibal Lecter, because there's no concept of us being able to say that women are complex, or there's many ways for women to be. So we have to sort of almost pick a side. Either you're on the side of the victims, or you're on the side of this aggressive woman.
Yeah, and it's almost like you actually, either you are a victim or you're like a traitor, right? She's a traitor kind of for, or that's the discourse around it, at least that's not what I'm saying. But I do think that's interesting. I don't think that, a male lawyer would at all be, if he fought for, the rights of women, or if a male lawyer were working on behalf of the women, the victims, would he be a traitor to his sex? Not at all, right? That would never be.
And then in terms of victims, it becomes part of this idea that we keep going back to, that what is the perfect victim, and that women are constantly held to these scripts socially, and then in the courtroom, and then otherwise, right? And I wonder that at the same time as people are thinking very hard about this trial and trying to think what went wrong and clearly angry, and all in these legitimate ways. But I think we're also seeing that vulnerability is prized in women in particular ways, and women have to make themselves vulnerable. And when you're outside that script, so when you see Marie Henein kind of not caring, like giving interviews and basically just saying this is the law, this is what is up, and I always felt that they would sort of wanted her to be emotional in those interviews, that then it would be okay. Which sort of plays into that script as well, that women are sort of forced into these emotional states. We're not credible if we don't participate in them, but then they're the very things that are used to discredit us.
Totally, yeah. Like her intellectual response to it all was not enough at all, right? People wanted her to kind of break down and have feelings one way or the other. We would have been happy with just seeing her have some kind of emotion, because it's not enough for her to just have an analysis of what was happening.
But then, as you say, that when the complainants follow that script, it's then backfires, because in being emotional, in messaging each other, all these things that they do that seem to be exactly what you need to do in order to be taken seriously, in terms of you have to be very traumatized, you have to so it also backfires. And then it's this idea again that women get caught, whatever you do as a woman, it's always going to backfire on you in some way, because you're always playing out this kind of image of what a perfect woman does, and no woman can fit into that, and it's always going to be inconsistent, it's always going to be fraught and troubled.
Yeah. So you can't really imagine a good scenario with the Jian Ghomeshi case. You can't really imagine any woman being up there and not having a hard time, because there is no way to fit the script perfectly, right?
So I don't know if you have any other comments.
No, that's everything, I think.
No, I think it's a really important conversation, and like as we're saying, it's not about devaluing people's experiences of trauma or ignoring them, but particularly in this light of people saying, well, how do we change the justice system? How do we create justice? The justice is always nuanced, and people's lives are always complex. So this idea of recognizing the kind of full range of experiences that women have, I think, is very important as well.